And take it away, Don.
Okay, thank you very much. Sally, thank you for the intro. As always, we're happy to be working with Larimer SBDC. I think we've been doing programs with you for several years now. Just to introduce myself, I'm Don Hobbs. I am a broker with Front Range Business, which is based out of Boulder. That's our primary operation, but we have offices in Breckenridge, Evergreen, and Fort Collins, and we are business brokers. So our responsibility, our task is bring buyers and sellers together in the market and effectively manage and lead those transactions. So Front Range Business has been around for over 30 years. I've been a broker for 7 years now at this point, and we've seen an awful lot of transactions. And so this is one of our ways of sharing our knowledge. So we've got, let me give you a little program look at what we're going to be doing today. So I always try and say it's not a how-to. You're not going to leave today and say, okay, I know everything that I need to know so that I can run my own transaction. What you are going to get is a really good introduction to, how the business transaction process works. And in particular, we're going to focus on how offers are made and dealt with, how contracts are put together, and how the closing happens. Every transaction is different. We certainly can't cover every variable that would come up. I'm always surprised by all the new ways, all the new curves that can be thrown at us whenever we do a transaction. But there is a lot of commonality, and we're going to bring all of that forward. We love questions. We want to get as many questions from you as you're willing to ask. The best way to do it is just to put them into the chat feature. When I see the questions, I'll either stop then or I'll move along and grab them at a little bit further time. And I also want to encourage you, the final slide will have contact information for Front Range Business. And we welcome the chance to speak with you after the program if you have any questions about the transaction process. I want to make one more point that's not on the slide, and that is, as a broker, I never want to think of a business transaction as a win-lose proposition. We always have to think of it as a win-win proposition. The seller is looking for the opportunity to exit their business with as much value intact as possible for a buyer. The buyer is looking to acquire the business and assume as much of that value as possible. It's very much a team effort. It's not a sharp knife exercise of whittling away at the transaction and somebody coming away a winner. It's really team. Everything we're going to talk about today, I want the buyers and the sellers to be aware of the exact same information. And I want them to feel like when putting together something like this, it's all about working as a team. So I'm going to emphasize that throughout. And having seen as many transactions as I've seen, worked with as many buyers and sellers, I can assure you that the more everyone works together, the better it goes, and the greater the chance that the buyer actually acquires the business and the seller actually sells it. As soon as people start stepping off into that other environment, it's much harder to do. So if I'm belaboring that, it's because it's really important. Now, in analyzing business transactions to get to the content today, we found that there's 9 steps involved from the beginning to the end. And the beginning for buyers and sellers is really thinking about sellers going, gee, do I really want to sell? What do I need to know to become a seller of my business? Am I ready? Buyer is, do I really want to buy? Do I want to leave my corporate job? Do I want to acquire this business, change my lifestyle, maybe move my geography? There's a lot of things that have to happen, in that initial exploration stage. And then it moves all the way up through closing. So there are 9 steps. And by the way, we have a program. We offer it through the Larimer SBDC. You can find it on their calendar. That's about the entire 9-step process. But there are 3 of those steps that are really involve contracts, legal matters, that, I've isolated those from the overall 9, and we're going to go into a little more depth on those than we can do in a full 9-step program. So the goal today is really look at offers, contracts, calling it the purchase agreement here, and the closing, that moment in time when the business actually moves from one person to another. We'll start with offers, and we'll just get going here. And I always say, this is, again, that preparatory stuff. If you're a buyer, before you make an offer, and it is your responsibility as the buyer to come forward with an offer, seller's going to let you know what's for sale and what price is on it, but you're making the offer. As a buyer, you really want to know your resources, your capabilities to acquire. You should have talked to a lender. You should have, known what's of interest to you. What are your skills, your capabilities? And you want to be prepared to prove it, because a seller is going to get offers from multiple people. And yes, they may be looking in some cases for the best price, but they're also looking for the best buyer. They're looking for the person who can represent that they are best ready to acquire this business. And so you're going to want to see that. What are you going to want to know as a buyer? Well, you're going to want to know if it's a good fit for you. You're going to want to know your skills. Are you an engineer trying to buy a manufacturing company? Or are you a dentist trying to buy a manufacturing company who doesn't have any experience with manufacturing? Might not be a good fit. Where's it going to happen? Is it going to be in the same metro area, but an incredibly long commute? And that's a really easy question to answer. Where's the business? Do I want to commute to that area? Or do I have to move? Do I have to relocate from Kansas City to Denver or Fort Collins to buy this business? Is that going to be worth it to me? Can I afford the personal real estate? We all know here along the Front Range, personal real estate is really expensive. Does it make enough money to support my family and my family circumstances? Do I have kids in a school? I can't move them. What industry is it in? What are the cycles in that industry? We know the new home industry is one very cyclical industry. Some people, that's fine. For other people, they can't deal with that. So these questions that we're asking here have little or nothing to do with the specific business outside of some structural elements of where it's located. And so as a buyer, those are the things you want to do first. Don't go chasing after a business and then finally say, well, I can't afford to live there, after you've taken up a lot of your time, the seller's time, the broker's time. You need to just get those things, out of the way. And you need to be able to clearly and thoughtfully answer this question. I want to purchase this business because, and have a good answer for that. And when you're ready to do that, you're ready to make an offer. What do good buyers know? Don't submit. By the way, I've got this LOI, that's letter of intent. We're going to talk about the letter of intent in a second, but that snuck in ahead of defining it. So I'll just change it to do not submit an offer if you aren't serious. Also keep in mind, as a buyer, you're not doing the seller a favor making an offer. You want to earn the winning bid, right? You are one of probably several buyers in the mix. If you want to get the business, you want to put your best foot forward. It's also important to recognize that the seller has been building up this company for years, maybe 10, maybe 20, maybe 30. They've built a lifestyle around this. They have a family of employees, and they're thinking about what's going to happen with those people. They may have civic connections. You know, there's lots of things that a longtime owner, now seller, is connected to their business around. Yes, the numbers are going to be important. You want to pay the right price for the business. But if you want to build as a buyer, if you want to build rapport with a seller, you want to get beyond the numbers, and you want to look at the other aspects of the business and really integrate those into their plan. Now, as a broker, one of the hardest activities that we have on the front end is making sure that we have appropriately priced a business. I'm going to use an example of $1 million price throughout the program today. But let's say we've put that $1 million price on it. We have not put $1 million price on it because we think it's worth $600,000 and we're hoping some buyer's going to come along and give us $1 million. And we've not put that $1 million price on it because we want to spend a whole bunch of time negotiating down to $700,000 and making everybody cranky and dealing with that. We've put the $1 million price on it because our experience as brokers tells us that this business is worth $1 million, that's what the marketplace reward to the buyer, to the seller should be. So if you as a buyer come in and you want to give less than the asking price, just be prepared to answer the question, why? Why is it not worth $1 million? You might have a very good reason. You might say, well, I'm going to be an investor and I'm going to have to put a general manager in rather than be an owner. So I'm going to have additional costs. To support those additional costs in the business, I can't afford to pay the same amount. Okay, we get it. You might say, I've looked at other businesses and my experience is that a business throwing off those kinds of profits might be worth a little less. Okay, you've got it. You've got an opinion. And you're welcome to bring it forward, but be prepared to indicate why you're not going to offer the price that's being asked. Another thing is with an offer, a good buyer recognizes they can't say, "Hey, I'm giving you an offer, and you only have 24 hours to review it, or I'm pulling it off the table." In the world of selling businesses, that just doesn't fly. It just doesn't work that way. Really what the seller is doing is trying to understand, what is the market for my business? They need time to digest your offer. They need time to compare your offer against others. Again, win-win, work with the seller on this. Win-lose, try and shut out any other offers, take control of the situation and force the seller into a corner. It's just not a positive experience for anybody. And so buyers should be prepared to let the market inform the seller of what really is going on there. And we always frame that up with the statement, deals move at the speed of trust. The more trust you can build between buyer and seller, the greater the chance that your offer is going to be the one that gets accepted. So that's some heads up for buyers. We've got some heads up for sellers coming in a little bit too here. So don't think we're just picking on buyers. We're going to pick on sellers as well. Okay, what is an offer? An offer really is the opportunity, expectation set for both sides. The learning, what is the price that this is going to have? What's this experience going to be like? What should I be prepared to bring forward? And how does this process work? So when an offer is made, there's a lot of expectation setting. if the buyer were to have mispriced the business, the marketplace is smart enough to know that. The marketplace is going to come in with 3 or 4 offers that are under the price that's been set. There may be some variability in what those prices are, but the seller's going to get some expectation setting of what the market is really going to do for them versus what they maybe thought it was going to do at the beginning. So, that's what's going on there. And beginning with an informal float. As a broker, I'm very comfortable with a buyer saying, hey, I'm thinking you've got $1 million on this. I'm thinking I'm going to come in at about 900,000. I might want to have a seller note involved. Just letting you know sort of where I'm coming in. They might be asking for a little guidance. That guidance might be, hey, we already have a stronger offer. If you're not prepared to, meet something stronger, might not be worth your time. Or the seller's not looking for a seller note. So, if you want to offer that price, go ahead, but low price plus seller note, probably not going to get the job done. That could be very helpful, that informal float. It's not an offer. Nothing has been received. It's just an opportunity to get some guidance together. What an offer is it's a letter of intent, which is a formal document that we're going to go in and talk about here. It is signed. It is submitted by the buyer to the seller. Brokers are often involved. Why are they involved? Because of all the things we're going to be talking about today, it's very likely that a buyer is going to overlook the opportunity to add some information to the letter of intent that's very useful to the seller to understand their offer. And if it's not in there from the beginning, the seller's just going to have to come back and put that in as we go along. Now, I've got a question from someone. They were saying, as a seller, do potential community ties tend to be positive or negative? For most businesses, the community ties tend to be very positive. If somebody's had a business operating a restaurant or some retail or commercial business, they're members of the Chamber of Commerce, and they know their neighbors and other people that are coming in for those businesses, they tend to be very, very positive. So knowing that a business is well positioned in the community can make a difference. So just jumped in with an answer to a question we got there. A couple more things about an LOI. It's a non-binding agreement. By that, I mean, hey, if you say, I've decided not to go through this, you're able to pull out. I use the example of Elon Musk buying Twitter right now. He signed a binding agreement, and they're trying to tell him, you have to buy this business, whether you want to buy it or not. That's going to wind up in a lawsuit. But there's clearly an example of a binding agreement. And just because somebody wants to pull out, doesn't mean they'll be able to. I talked about, getting guidance. We want to avoid loose ends, avoid unaddressed items. It can lead to disagreements. But because it's non-binding, you don't have to get hung up on perfect language, representations and warranties, things like that. You just want to get your deal points organized and put down. So let's start walking through it. Let's start looking at what the contents of a letter of intent are and what those deal points are. So the very first thing you're going to do is you're going to put down the total dollar amount that you're going to pay for the business. Now, we're offering this business for $1 million, and guess what? Today we got an offer for $1 million. So I'm going to continue using that number. I realize that may or may not be what happens with any other business, but that's the one we're using today. So you're going to say, I'm offering $1 million. Okay, now we know the price that you're willing to pay. A business can be acquired different ways. I'm not going to go through them today because I talk about that in detail in some other programs, but the most common ways to acquire a business is an asset acquisition. There is a corporation. You're not buying the entire corporation, you're buying the assets of the corporation. All of those things that are in place that allow you to operate the business, but not the business, not the corporate entity itself. And the other would be if you're taking over the entire corporation, that would be a stock purchase where you're buying the entire entity. You take it over, the entire S or C Corp, or if it happens to be an LLC, you'd be taking over the entire membership interest. That's the exact same thing, but the name that you give it if it's LLC related. And asset acquisitions are far and away the most common. A reason to do a stock purchase might be because a business has government contracts. And for those government contracts to transfer, you need to transfer the entire corporate entity. That would be an example of a reason to do it. There are others. I did one recently where, because of a particular liquor license issue, it was easier to transfer the entire corporation than it would have been to just transfer the assets. It reduced the amount of effort going into getting the liquor license. So there can be reasons, but it's most common asset acquisition. All right, let's look at the next baseline business terms. These are the things that need to be understood between buyer and seller so that you understand the price paid and the value being delivered. So one would be included inventory. Does the $1 million price include inventory, or is inventory expected to be purchased for more? Now, at the end of the day, you could kind of do it any way you want to do it. But in one case, the total price remains $1 million, because I'll make up a number. There's $100,000 in included inventory. And in the other one, if it's $1 million price and the buyer has to pay $100,000 extra, then the total price is really $1,100,000. What we need to get to here is, what is the deal package? So you need to specify included inventory. Same thing for working capital. Working capital is the money that a buyer needs to operate the business after the purchase. In the case of a restaurant, you don't need very much working capital because every day you're getting cash from your patrons. So you have money in the bank every single day to run that restaurant. But if you're a manufacturing company that has a very slow build process, you need to have a whole bunch of money available to get through that build process before you're able to sell your products. So again, does the price that you're paying, that $1 million, include any working capital? Now, I will say, most commonly with small business sales, it does not include working capital. It's the buyer's responsibility to bring that to the table after they have purchased the business. And again, that's another one to talk about in great detail, but today we'll just indicate no working capital. Work in progress, known as WIP, that is talked about a manufacturing company with a very slow build. This is an adjustment that might be made. For example, let's say the company being sold builds cabinets. And so they do custom cabinets. So they have things that they have taken an order on that they haven't started. They have things they've taken an order on and they've added the inventory. They have things they've taken an order on, they've added inventory and some labor, and they have things they've taken orders on that they're very close to actually delivering to the customer. This would be what's in place at the time of closing. Well, the more work they've done, the more cost the seller has assumed. And so included in this adjustment and price needs to be a mechanism for settling this work in progress so that the seller receives some amount of support for the work in progress that they've done. So it needs to be in the letter of intent. Escrows, also known as holdbacks, we see this in a deal. If a buyer is planning to say, I'm going to put a certain amount of money in holdback or in escrow to make sure that all of the customers stay with the business for 6 months after the sale, well, that needs to be known up front. You don't want to introduce that later on in the transaction. Or I want to hold some money to make sure I have proof of all the taxes have been paid, things like that. And if you're planning for your offer to require an earnout, like $200,000 of my price is only going to happen if I have the same revenue in the year after closing that you had in the year before closing, then that needs to be stated. You can't introduce that later. Those are all things that need to be in an LOI up front. Really quickly, another one is, hey, because I'm genuinely interested in buying this business, I'm going to give you some earnest money. We're selling the business for $1 million. And so I'm going to give you 1% of that $1 million price as earnest money. That would be $10,000. Or maybe you really want to make a statement of how interested you are. I'm going to give you $20,000 or $30,000. And that's earnest money that you put in. That money is held in escrow. It's your proof of interest. It also helps the seller know, hey, this buyer could get their hands on some money. So if they can get their hands on some money, I'm a little more confident about them. However, earnest money at this offer level, the letter of intent level, is typically fully refundable for any reason if a deal is canceled. Again, the goal is you want to get it in. Earnest money needs to be in the offer. I have another question here, goes to what we were just talking about. How often do you see holdbacks and earnouts on deals? Just answer the question really quickly. If there is a SBA loan being used to finance the business, you cannot have an earnout. So it can't be part of the deal if there's an SBA loan and earn out. An earn out is an additional amount of money that's paid to the seller after the transaction. What you can have with an SBA loan is what's called an earn down, which is where the full price is offered for the business. The deal package is put together with that full price, but an amount of money goes in as a holdback or an escrow or an earn down and gets refunded to the buyer should there not be the performance that's expected on the business. And the SBA will allow that to happen. How often do we see them? We're beginning to see earn downs more frequently. We used to not see those. Again, with an SBA loan, you can't have an earn out. So that has to be financed in another way. But since the large majority of businesses are financed with SBA loans, we don't see a lot of earnouts unless it's really a seller financed kind of transaction or alternate financing. All right, let's look at the offer we've done so far. We've priced it at $1 million. We've said it's an asset sale. We know it's going to include $100,000 in inventory. We know that working capital is not included. We know that work in progress is not included. Maybe this is a B2B commercial cleaning business where they go in and clean office buildings. Well, there's not going to be any work in progress with that. We do know that there's going to be an escrow of $75,000, a holdback for customer retention in the first year. At the end of first year, depending on what's happened with the customers that are expected to be transferred, because after all, that is the value of the business, and $25,000 until proof that all taxes are paid. So there's $100,000 escrow happening here. We did not have an earn out or an earn down, and the buyer put in $10,000 earnest money. So again, just want to kind of look, what have we done so far? All those things, but there's still more. One thing to be done in a letter of intent is how is a purchase paid for? So there's really only three sources of funds to purchase any business. There's different flavors, but there's three sources of funds. One is money that the buyer brings to the table in the form of cash, down payment. And we typically see anywhere from 10% to 30%. It depends on the buyer. It depends on the business. It depends on the lender. It depends on the industry. There's all different things, but the most common is probably 10 to 30% of buyers. Now, where do they get their money? They can get it from savings. They can get it from IRAs. They can get it from a home equity line of credit. They can get it from Hobbs. There's multiple locations that they might get their buyer equity from, but it's still one source as it arrives at the transaction. The next is an SBA commercial lender. SBA lenders, I tell everybody, think of them as your best friend. They are the people that make it possible to buy businesses because they're prepared to lend 70 or 80% of the price of a business. Meaning, if you as a buyer have $150,000 that you can put down and you can get an SBA lender to bring all the rest, you know, you can buy a business close to $1 million in price, in value, for just $150,000. That's a really great deal for you. And we know that buyers want to buy typically the most expensive business that they can buy. The third source of revenue is a seller promissory note. This is where the seller helps the deal come together by putting together a promissory note for some of the transaction. Now, most common is zero. That's the seller not giving a promissory note, up to 20%. This is the amount that sellers would put in the form of a promissory note if there is a commercial lender. If the business cannot be financed or the deal can't come together with an SBA lender, that seller promissory note can be 95%. 5% down. Let's say somebody's got a relatively small business. They want to sell to an employee. Employees typically don't have very much money. They might put 5% down and the seller might finance 95% of the business. That is not uncommon. And so that can happen. But if there is an SBA or commercial lender, most common is going to be 10% or something. SBA loans do not require a seller note. An SBA lender might look at a particular buyer, the amount of cash, equity, collateral that they have, look at a business, think in terms of the risk, and the lender who's handling that SBA loan might ask for a seller note. But that's not necessarily a requirement of the SBA that there be one there. And so as you get into it, but if you as a buyer already know that you're going to want a seller note, it should be indicated in the letter of intent that you expect a seller note to be part of this transaction. Sometimes it's not indicated up front, but it winds up needing to be added. All right, what's another thing we need to know? We need to know the timeline. A letter of intent isn't an open-ended offer to close anytime you want down the road, 6 months or a year. It's an offer for this transaction to happen during a specific period of time. So the dates that need to be in there are how long before this offer that I've presented needs to be signed. And usually we look at a week or 2 weeks as a period of time that it takes to move through this, or at least for the seller to respond recognizing that with so many items here, there's going to be some negotiation back and forth. And there's many more moving parts than there are with a house or a commercial property. It's why it takes longer for this to all work out. And then now you've got a date. You say, okay, we'll get this thing signed in 2 weeks. We have a signed letter of intent. When is the actual purchase agreement, that second stage contract, that legally binding contract, going to be signed? I like to indicate 30 to 45 days, because that's that period of time, not only to get that contract put together, but also for the buyer to be doing due diligence completion, or a substantial portion of that. And so, we like for due diligence to be completed around about the time the purchase agreement. Can't always all be done, but the more of it that can be done, the more certainty we have that the buyer is satisfied with this transaction, that the seller is satisfied with the terms of the deal, and that we're going to be able to move to closing. So those are often running in parallel. And then ultimately, there's a closing date. And our experience is that if the purchase agreement gets done in 30 to 45 days, it's another 45 days, maybe 60 days, because the SBA lender is now the party that is driving the timeline, getting it through their processes and underwriting for the SBA lender to make the funds available. So from LOI to closing, 3 months is probably a minimum period of time that you're going to see. 4 months, 5 months, entirely possible. But it's good to indicate what the buyer's intentions are and have the seller be able to respond to that. Things that can adjust closing might be, hey, I'm relocating from Dallas. I'd like to relocate over the summer when my kids aren't in school. Can I get an extra 30-day delay so my kids can finish school? Things like that. We can buy a house. There can be outside reasons why a transaction is slower or faster. It could be faster. I need to get this done as the seller because I have health issues. The sooner, the better. So, it's a negotiation, but you want to try and get, again, those dates down. Hey, another item, super important. How is this business going to transition from the seller to the buyer? What kind of support is going to be involved? Is it the kind of thing where the buyer already owns 4 Thai restaurants and they're buying another Thai restaurant and they're going to know what to do the minute they walk in on day one? Or is it something where the buyer doesn't have a tremendous amount of experience in this industry and they're going to need to learn a lot? So the buyer's expectations in terms of what they want the seller to do and how long they want to do it for and how much time, sellers want to know that. They want to know, when do I get to take that vacation to Rome instead of sitting around here in my business not getting paid to help the next guy learn how to run it? Am I going to be able to do some of this on premise or remote? Take into account that it's a seasonal business. If you have a retail store that ramps up massively around Christmas, training in February or March isn't going to be nearly as important as training in August, September, October, when you're ramping up that inventory and making plans for what's going on. So thinking in terms of the schedule of the business. As a broker, it's pretty close to 100% of the time that buyers ask for too much training. They want to mitigate the risk. They want to know the seller's going to be there. More often than not, what we see is the buyer saying, oh, okay, I got a handle on this. I don't need all the hours that I asked for. They don't know that up front, but they know it after the fact. And I'm just letting buyers know that's our experience. They seldom, if ever, wind up with too little training support. But what we also know is whatever you put down and say you'd like to have in a letter of intent, that can be modified when you do due diligence. you might find out that the processes to operate the business are so well documented that you need less training. You might offer a little less, or you might find out just the opposite, that those processes are really sloppy and you're going to need some more help to get those documented. So the things you learn can affect that. We also are going to add exclusivity. This is something that's always in a letter of intent. And, buyers are going to go out and they're going to look on the internet and they're going to see a clause that says, the minute seller receives this offer, they're going to shut down talking to anybody else, and I'm going to be exclusive, and you can't reveal anything under penalty of death. And, I've seen such incredibly restrictive exclusivity language. And again, deals move at the speed of trust, not a lot of trust there, a lot of attempt to control the seller's opportunity to know what the market is going to think about their business. So, let's get a little more balanced. What is the goal? The goal of exclusivity is to give the buyer an unobstructed path to make the deal happen. Once the seller says, I want to work with you, buyer, then it is reasonable for that buyer to have a chance to do everything they need to do and not have the rug pulled out from underneath them. Completely understand that. But, we talked about this is a non-binding letter of intent. This is the buyer is able to walk away at any time, and the seller is holding all of that risk. Why would a seller want to take a business completely off the market, not have any more conversations with potential buyers, and shut them all down until you, as the buyer, have made a more formal commitment, which is the contract? So as a broker, I work with the sellers and I work with the buyers to find language that allows both things to happen. The seller to have a plan B and the buyer to pursue their plan A. And that's what we're really going for here. And that exclusivity should have an expiration deadline. Again, it should be tied to the ability to get into a contract where you can really lock this transaction down. It should not be just open-ended. So exclusivity needs to be dealt with. And then due diligence. So due diligence is going on after there's some of it going on in advance. Obviously, you need to see the financials to know you want to make an offer and things like that. But due diligence goes on a lot more involved due diligence goes on during the time after the LOI is signed and before the contract. I tell buyers, please do not go out to the internet and pull down a list of every due diligence item that you could possibly want to see. Again, you're just going to peeve off the seller and the broker. What I usually tell them is, ask for what you need. Tell us why you need it. Tell us how that information is going to help you make a decision about whether you're going to buy the business. Because it's not an opportunity to learn how to operate the business. What you're trying to do is determine if the representations of the seller are accurate and whether the business has the value that you believed it had when you bought it. So that's what you're looking to do. And I love it when a buyer is able to say, I'm going to want this, 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 and this. And if I find that they are materially inaccurate, or it demonstrates that the business is not as valuable, I'll want the right to terminate the transaction. Or if I find it is, I'll want to move forward. So you're looking for that material evaluation, not looking for operating information. An example, if it's a restaurant, you do not need the recipes at this point, right? That's operating information. Obviously the business has recipes. They make this food. It's making profits. People love it. but you don't need that at this point. You got to give the seller a reasonable time to deliver. The more you're asking for, the longer it takes for the seller to get it together. Keep in mind, sellers have never done this before. They didn't go into this having accumulated a large pile of due diligence information. They have to go home at night, tired from work, and dig into their files and try to find some of these things so that they can deliver them to you. Now, good ones will try and assemble some of this in advance to make it easier, but it's not easy. And so, over asking, over demanding is just a way to stress out the transaction, especially anything that didn't help you make a decision about buying it. Okay. And so it's also a time for the seller, because the seller is looking at the buyer's capability. Buyer, have you been to a lender? What are the results of that? Buyer, I might want to put you in touch with the landlord during this period of time so that we can make sure you can get a lease. We're trying to look at the flip side of this. It's not just seller presenting things, it's buyer presenting their ability to put this deal together. So we've got to look at them from both ways. Got another question here. How do sellers protect their position and information regarding their business and performance? So anytime we enter into a letter of intent, there is also confidentiality provisions. So you can withhold certain things. When you say sellers protect their position and information, there's a lot going on there. So in a non-disclosure environment, deals move at the speed of trust. If you don't trust the buyer after you've been working with them, the way you protect it is you dump the buyer. And so, you can make that decision. But if you trust the buyer and you have a non-disclosure, then you can reveal a lot of things. There are certain things that sellers don't like to do. For example, sellers don't like to introduce buyers to their employees because of the potential disruption. Employees go, wait a minute, there's going to be a new owner. I wonder if they're going to keep my job. I wonder if I should start looking for another job. You don't want employees going down that path of perceiving risk. So a lot of times there is zero opportunity to meet the employees in advance of the transaction. Where that usually works is if the owner is the full-time operator and there's really no second in command operating as general manager. However, when you have an owner operator, then you do have, when you do have a general manager, oftentimes it's really important for the buyer and the general manager to agree on what the future holds for that general manager, because it could be more opportunity, in which case there's a good reason to get together. So it's a non-disclosure, and it's in that's the best answer I can give for today. I would certainly be willing to go into that some more. A deal's also going to have contingencies. We're almost at the end of what's included in a letter of intent, but a deal is also going to have contingencies, and these aren't really optional. This deal is contingent upon being able to get lender financing. If you can't get lender financing, you can't buy it. So that's going to be a contingency. It's contingent upon getting landlord approval and a suitable lease, either as an assignment or as a new lease. If you as the buyer can't get landlord approval to come in and take over, you can't buy the business. So that's a contingency that you need to work on. And I'll just, for people who don't know this yet, but you get into the buying or selling process, you're going to find out that landlords have a lot of power and some of them like to wield it. So it's an important issue to take into account. You might have a licensing requirement. You can't buy this business if you can't get a liquor license or if you can't get a trade license of some sort. So that's a contingency. That's just something that has to happen. Or it might be that you have a supplier or a franchisor Let's say that you are a bicycle store and you sell specialized bicycles as your primary brand. There's going to be a supplier agreement that you have to enter into. They have to approve you as the new buyer of this business for you to be able to get supplied with specialized bikes. You won't be able to transfer the value of the business without that. So those are contingencies that are not optional, things that could be optional contingencies that may or may not be in. Key employee, the ability to talk to key employees, talked about that a minute ago. A non-compete, if you have a 75-year-old retiring owner in ill health, probably not going to get back into business and compete with you. You treat that as you will. But if you have somebody who you think could robustly open up a similar business, then you're going to want a non-compete from that person, which always covers three things: a period of time, often 3-4 years, a location, geographic location, 25 miles from Fort Collins, and an activity doing the same or similar things. That's what your non-compete will cover. It would, typically due diligence, buyer satisfaction with validation of books and records. Sure, that's a legitimate contingency. Don't have to have it, but it makes sense. And no material change in the business. If all of a sudden, I've seen this happen, a hair salon has 8 chairs and 3 salon workers up and leave during the time the business is for sale. All of a sudden you have a material change in your business, or you have a key customer who gives notice that they're not going to stay on as a customer. So those are good, optional, not required, but optional contingencies that you should have. All right. So we talked about what we had: $1 million price, asset sale, 100,000 in inventory, no working capital, no work in progress, escrows, no earn out, 10,000 earnest money. Now we're going to add to that. The buyer's going to bring 200,000 in buyer equity, $725,000 SBA loan, and a $75,000 seller note at 5 years and 7%. Now we know how they intend to pay for it. We're going to get to an LOI in 10 days. We're going to get to a purchase agreement in 45 days following the LOI, and in closing 60 days following the purchase agreement. We're going to request 40 hours of on-site training to happen in the first 20 days after closing. We're going to ask for 20 hours of additional remote training in the next 30 days and 20 hours remote training in the next 6 months. That's not a perfect formula for every business. That's just a formula that works. It'll be what it is, but you need to put something down so the seller can understand what their commitment is. And we know that the seller will not enter into any other LOI prior to the purchase agreement or the purchase agreement target date, but the seller will talk to buyers. So we know that those things are going to occur. Everybody is in agreement. That's acceptable. And then we have the final deal points are a due diligence period, that during the due diligence period, there's going to be a landlord meeting set up. During the due diligence period, the buyer is going to select their lender and get a commitment letter that says the lending is going to be in place for this transaction. We're going to look at, whether there's any licensed supplier or franchise. In this particular case, we're saying there's none needed, which is fine. But if there were, it would be dealt with. And then contingencies that continue on is getting that financing, getting that lease, getting that buyer satisfaction with books and records, and no material change in the business, non-compete, 3 years, 25 miles in the same business or industry. Okay, I talked about good buyers. I said sellers. I'm going to come back to you and talk a little bit about things you need to keep in mind. Number one, every offer, every buyer is going to have strengths and weaknesses. You need to understand what is most important to you so that you can select the appropriate offer, select the appropriate buyer, because you may have several of them at the same time. Is it timeliness? I need to get this done quickly. Is it price? I need the highest price. Is it a clean exit? Is it making sure that the buyer wants to keep all your employees, or do they want to move the business and let them go? Is it whether there is or isn't a seller note? Is it the personal connection you make with the buyer? I can see this buyer keeping the continuity. So as a seller, you want to be thinking and focused on what it is that makes an offer mean the most to you. It's always a negotiation. You can't just dig your heels in and say, nope, 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 I went to market with this. You know, if somebody says, I need a little more time to get this done, all right, be prepared to offer a little more time. Be prepared for flexibility. The marketplace may not think that your business is worth as much as it was thought of at the time it was priced. Might have been something that changed in your business, might have been something that changed in the industry, might have just missed it, right? Whatever it is, be prepared. You may have to negotiate. Remember, you got into this position because you want to sell your business. You're committed to selling. So you need to recognize you may have to compromise to get it done. Sellers, only one LOI. Certainly, if you're working with me as your broker, I would never let you enter into 2 LOIs. Legally, you can, but deals move at the speed of trust, and that is not building trust. When you tell somebody that you've entered into an LOI, but you're going to cancel it because you're selling it to somebody else. It's just not the way it happens. Okay, we're going to keep moving here. We have finished the LOI, which is really, in many ways, the hardest and most challenging because you have to get so many things figured out right from the get-go, which allows you to move on to the next. This is that period of time. It's going to happen 30 or 40 days after a letter of intent where we're going to enter into a contract. If the LOI is the non-binding intention to purchase, the purchase agreement is the binding contract to purchase. We talked about an asset purchase and therefore an asset purchased agreement being the most common, where you're buying the assets underneath the corporate umbrella of the entity. You're not buying the entire entity. And we refer to an asset purchase agreement as an APA. So that's what we're going to be, looking at today. It's a legally binding agreement. When you enter into an APA, you can be held as a buyer to account. You must buy this business. And if you're a seller, you must sell this business. You can't decide not to do these things. The attorneys are going to get involved. The more experience an attorney has with business transactions, the better. When you write that APA, that asset purchase agreement, it ultimately becomes the playbook. Everything that happens after this and all the closing documentation and everything is going to be based on what the purchase agreement said. It's typically 10 to 30 pages. It may have some extended exhibits that go beyond that. So what happens between signing the LOI and getting the APA? Just to refresh, you got to get the lender and the loan commitment. You will not be able to enter into a purchase agreement if you're not able to identify who the lender is and that the lender is prepared to give you money. Now, lenders kind of hang back and they withhold a little bit, and they may not make it a guaranteed loan, but they're going to be able, a good lender is going to be able to say, I got this deal. We're going to get it through underwriting. It's going to happen. This is a good buyer. You can be confident. And they give a commitment letter. It might have some contingencies in it, but they give a commitment letter. So you want that. You want that lease. Buyer is also going to want to establish a business entity. You're either going to be an LLC or an S Corp or a C Corp, and you're going to move all the assets that you're purchasing into that, get that entity done, and work on any other contingencies that happen to be in the LOI. You want to get these known. Good buyers know, here's my scolding slide, things that I try and inform you of early on. Good buyers know you don't change the LOI price and terms at purchase agreement unless you have encountered material issues that have changed the value of the business. You made an offer to buy it. You knew enough when you made that offer that that was the price you were willing to pay. Don't change it. Expectation of certainty. When you enter into a contract, it's an expectation of certainty. It was an expectation of intention to do the LOI, but it's certainty to complete the transaction. We should be at 99.99% likelihood that this deal is going to close when we do an APA. The majority of your due diligence is done. The buyer advanced preparatory tasks like getting your entity is done. I'm going to repeat again. Deals move at the speed of trust. Buyer and seller should be working together to get this done. What are common things that do change from an LOI? Well, sometimes when you get to the APA, you make a change in the earnest money. You might say that earnest money is now non-refundable in the event of buyer default. Or you might say, we got $10,000 with the LOI, we're asking for $20,000, an additional 10 to enter into this APA. We see that, that's common. Contingencies are often reduced because they're completed, but we might retain, got to be able to get the loan, got to be able to get the lease, material change. Makes a lot of sense to keep those contingencies in place right up through closing. Financing, we're going to ask for proof of lender commitment. We're going to want to see the loan having gone into underwriting. The lender may now come back and ask for other documentation that the lender needs. It's not what the buyer needs, it's what the lender needs. We might adjust the closing timeline for practical realities, things that have taken a little bit longer or things we now know that we didn't know early on. Again, it's a negotiation between buyer and seller, but we'll see that happen. Exclusivity, when we get to a purchase agreement, and I've got that 99.99% certainty, sure, it's fair to take the business off the market, inform the buyers that, you know, at this point, we can't have any further discussions. That's fine. Transition support, often tweaked or modified, something you've learned. I tell buyers, your best training is going to come from your employees, not from the seller of the business. And as they get closer to the business and learn more, they may realize that. And then with the purchase agreement, there'll be exhibits added. This is the inventory. This is the furniture, fixtures, and equipment that's being sold with it. The purchase agreement also needs to look at some financial adjustments that need to be made. Let's say you're in a business where there are a lot of customer deposits in the bank. Does the seller just get to keep all those customer deposits? The buyer is going to have to deliver the services or the products. If the seller keeps the deposits, sounds like a net loss for the buyer. That doesn't make any sense. So a plan for the division of customer deposits gets worked out in the purchase agreement. Now, some of that deposit, it's legitimate for the seller to keep. They did have the cost of getting that customer sold and collecting that deposit. So there can be some amount of money related to the potential profitability of that transaction, but the majority of it is going to move to the buyer. Retention of cash on hand. This is just typically in a purchase agreement, and with an asset agreement, asset purchase, the seller invariably keeps all of the cash that's in the bank. That stays with the seller, but it needs to be provided for in the purchase agreement. There are accounts receivable at the time of closing, depending on the type of business you have. You could have people that aren't going to pay you for 10 days, 30 days, 45 days. Those are for services previously delivered. That money rightly belongs to the seller. So as those accounts receivable are collected, that money is going to be transferred to the seller. Responsibility for accounts payable. There are things that have been ordered. There are bills that are due. There needs to be how to provide for those accounts payable getting done. Seller is going to have some deposits. They might have a deposit with the landlord. They might have a deposit on their utilities, depending on the type of business. Some of these can be pretty large. So there needs to be a plan for, are those going to transfer to the buyer and be taken care of on a settlement at closing? Are they going to be refunded to the buyer and the buyer's going to put in new deposits? Whatever the plan, there isn't necessarily a right way to do it, but how it's going to be done needs to be specified. And then there are also things called prorations. These are for prepaid costs or postpaid costs for operating the business. Let's say you close on the 15th of the month and you have a $10,000 a month rent. Rent is paid in advance. So the seller has paid $5,000 of the buyer's rent. There should be a provision for the buyer to refund that $5,000 to the seller. So those are important things. In the old days, there were a lot of really expensive long distance charges for phones. Long distance is paid in arrears. So the buyer would wind up with all the costs for time that the seller was using long distance. So you would, pay those. So depending on whether an expense is in arrears or in advance, you make a settlement adjustment. And you note all of those on the in the purchase agreement of what you're going to do. You make the settlement at closing, but you note how you're going to do it. The APA often has the methodology. You're going to want to put what assets are going to transfer. It's going to be all the tangibles assets. These are things like your vehicles, equipment, fixtures, leasehold improvements, supplies, anything that is kind of a physical item is going to transfer. And your list might become very extensive. Sometimes it's a little bit generic, but sometimes you list every single item. I've seen lists that are pages and pages long, and they often have some value. Lenders will want you to list and note any item worth more than $5,000 typically, any single item, because they're going to want to attach that on their loan. So not only do you list the things, sometimes it's serial numbers, and then you have intangibles. Intangibles are things like your trade names, websites, domain names, social media, customer lists, email lists, phone numbers, financial records. All of those are intangible assets. And again, you're going to want to make a list of all of those. And then you're going to list anything that's excluded. You may have tangible or intangible assets that you exclude. I'll give you an example. I sold a company that its primary business was selling t-shirts, but it had a small secondary business selling children's books. We excluded all of the children's books activity. Even though it was all run under one company, that did not transfer. That's an example of an exclusion. I'm selling a business now that has it's a restaurant and it has seasonal displays. And the seller is just really fond of this small portable fountain that they use in a seasonal display, and they want to keep that fountain. It's probably worth $150, but if it's not going to go with the business and the buyer has already seen it, you need to exclude it so that you don't run into problems. Allocation of the price. Total price broken into categories. This one's complicated, but that price is $1 million. And so that $1 million is going to be made up of things. I'm not going to go deep into this today, except to say, we know that there's 100,000 in inventory. We're going to say that there's 100,000 in tangible assets. We're going to say that there are some intangible assets. We'll look at those like non-competes. You have to put a value on those, and goodwill. So here's the allocation: 1 million total price, 100,000 inventory, 100,000 FFE, 5,000 non-compete, 5,000 training, and 790,000 in goodwill. Goodwill is really the amount of value in the business after these other assets are identified with specific values. Goodwill is really the amount left over, and goodwill is the value of a business over and above its physical assets. It's the reason it's making money. Sure, it has all these physical assets, but when you look at the financials and see how much money the business is making, that's because of the goodwill. It's the way those assets are used. Work in progress, another difficult category to look at. We've talked about it though. We're going to adjust for things that are partially built. We're going to look at that. We want to take care of that. Tax obligations. You know, when an asset transfer happens, one of the reasons that a buyer likes that is they don't take on the liabilities of the previous corporation. They're only taking on the assets. One thing that's different is that tax liability often transfers with the business owners. So you want to make sure the tax obligations are covered. And if you remember, we had an escrow up front of $25,000 to make sure that could happen. Seller will be responsible for tax liabilities. Payment taxes, however, is often in arrears. So it's important to have settlement for that. Debts and loans in the purchase agreement, you want to indicate that all debts are to be retired or paid off. The buyer is not assuming any liabilities for those debts. We don't have as much trouble with that with PPP declining as we used to, because PPP loans are pretty much, they've all been forgiven. Most of them have been forgiven. They're not part of the transaction. But for a few years there, we had some real issues with PPP loans on the books and not being forgiven. And how do you sell a business with a PPP loan that's outstanding? So make sure you know what's going on, but almost all of them. You're going to want to deal with employees in the purchase agreement. By the way, I put the hardest question first. Do any employees need to be terminated? If so, it's really the seller's responsibility. An example: there's a current general manager. The owner operator is planning to come in and fulfill that general manager role. The new buyer doesn't want to come in and have their first act be to fire a beloved general manager of the business. This is a tricky thing. It's hard. It needs to be thought about. There needs to be a plan identified between buyer and seller. If there are any key employees that need to be retained for the transaction to happen, that needs to be identified. How are the employees going to be told should be identified. You want to talk about when payroll is going to transition. Is it going to be the current seller pays through midnight, the night before closing, and the buyer takes over with brand new payroll? Or is the current payroll going to work and there's going to be a settlement of future payroll? They're all good, but you have to figure it out. A lot of purchase agreements will say employees will not get raises prior to closing. They don't want the seller to just give everybody a raise right before they take over. That should be the buyer's responsibility to look at. Take care of accrued employee benefits and bonus plans. If there are any that are going to transfer to a liability of the buyer, that needs to be dealt with, or they can be cashed out by the seller. There's multiple ways to do it, but you want to deal with it. And employee policies for vacation, things like that, illness, you know, what's going on there. You want to make sure you know. Possession. When is a business going to transfer? It's typically done at midnight, the night before closing at midnight. So we say the new owner, the buyer, owns the day of closing. All of the financial responsibilities are theirs. Happy moment where the keys are given over. Representations and warranties. These are really boilerplate. We're running a little late. So, you know, you're going to get a copy of this slide deck and you'll be able to see them. There's not much to talk about on these, just to know that all of these things need to be included and are included in a purchase agreement. So they're legal language, they're standard, they're typically not negotiated. They're just very common, but you want to get them in there. You've got a purchase agreement, you go to closing. With 9 minutes to go, I want to make sure I get all this done. The legal transfer of the business from owner to seller, it's detailed. If anybody is worth their money, it is the closing attorney. I am astonished. They typically charge anywhere from $2,500 to $4,000, depends on the transaction. It is the best money ever spent to make sure that a business is properly transferred. So I'm telling you, you want to get that attorney who's experienced, and a broker can help guide you to a good attorney. And the buyer and seller need to agree. Yep, we're going to use this person, and they typically split that cost. So if it's a $3,000 cost, it's $1,500 each. Best money ever spent. What kinds of things does that escrow attorney do? They check to see if there's any liens on the business in advance, so there's time to resolve them. There can be liens. They obtain any payoff statements. If the seller has a loan that's going to come due and they have to pay it off with the proceeds from closing, that attorney is making sure that they know what those payoff statements are. They check on personal property taxes, so there can be a settlement. They validate that the seller and buyer entities are correct, and they're able to make this transaction. They're registered with the state, they're current. They coordinate with the SBA lender on any language that needs to be in the closing paperwork regarding the SBA loan and subordination, and various language things they're going to have. They are going to become the escrow agent. That's the person who receives all those inbound funds from the buyer, from the SBA lender, or from the seller in the form of a seller note, or from the broker in the form of any earnest money they've been holding. All that money gets to the escrow attorney, and they're going to prepare all the closing documents for advance review. So they're going to put together, we'll see what those are, but they've got to get those done. So there's a number of closing documents, closing instructions. That's the sheet that says everything that's going to happen at closing. Settlement statements, what money is going to move back and forth for work in progress, deposits, those kinds of things. Entity resolutions. My LLC agrees and resolves that it is prepared to sell this business. My S Corp agrees and resolves that it is prepared to buy this business. You need resolutions from the entities. They're done by the escrow attorney. Bill of sale for tangible assets. Those come with a bill of sale, all that furniture, fixture, and equipment things we've talked about. There are vehicle odometer statements, because if you're transferring a vehicle with the business, Colorado law requires that. That needs to be done. Assignments of intangible assets, equipment leases. So for example, you might have a very expensive copier as part of your business operations, which you have on a lease. So those need to be properly assigned and accounted for in your closing documentation. Obviously, your premise lease with the landlord, intangible assets, all of those need to be assigned. They're assignment documents. Non-competition is a formal agreement that the parties enter into. There could be a promissory note, a security agreement. These are all things we've kind of talked about before, but now you see them coming in. Whoops, misspelling on statement for the UCC financing statement. That just says if there's a seller promissory note and financing, that's done properly. There's a deed of trust. There's a personal property tax agreement. There's an escrow agreement. We talked about the money that you were going to set aside. Personal property tax agreement, when personal property, which is that tangible assets category, is sold from seller to buyer, depending on what locale it operates in, there might be sales tax to be paid on that. So that personal property tax, you need an agreement. Who's going to be responsible for the sales tax and how's it going to get paid? Lots of little details. A good closing attorney is really looking after making sure all of that's covered. There's going to be a location where closing happens. That might also occur concurrently with a loan or a property closing. I sold a business recently. There was a piece of property and there was a SBA loan. So the SBA lender showed up and closed the SBA loan so that those funds would then be made available. Then the title company came in and they closed on the property, and then the business transaction happened. So those happened in sequence concurrently on at a single location. You might need notary services for things that need to be notarized. You might need copier scanner to get documents out. You might need some additional secretarial services. Again, when you're getting a closing attorney, you want to make sure that all of these are there. And then, of course, now the money's going to go back out. The closing paperwork is signed. The money goes back out, and you get sellers going to get their proceeds. The loan payoffs are made. The escrows are held. The broker commissions are paid. The broker referral fees. It could be that this transaction occurred because one broker passed the deal opportunity to another broker, and there's referral fees to pay out. And there may be the legal fees, the closing fees. Sometimes attorneys want to have the services they provided to the buyer or to the seller also taken out of the closing funds. So we see that happen. I've got a great question. Can the transfer attorney, the closing attorney or escrow attorney, transfer attorney, and the attorney for the purchase agreement be the same? Yes and no. So for the purchase agreement, the buyer and the seller are each going to have their own attorney. As a broker, I am comfortable with the closing attorney being either the attorney for the buyer or the seller if they have an escrow account, they're experienced, they're prepared to meet the scope of work that we have asked for, because the closing attorney is not an advisory role. It's very much a transactional role. And they actually enter into agreements with buyers and sellers to say that they're entering in only as a transactional role. They're not taking any advisory role to buyer or seller. They're not a fiduciary in that form. So yes, they can be the same if they meet these other criteria. And then post-closing, there are filings that have to get done. Articles of amendment, entities might change. If the name of the business, Bob's Car Wash, is the same as the name of the entity of the seller, Bob's Car Wash, Inc., the buyer may want to get Bob's Car Wash, Inc. for themselves. So there would be an entity name change, even though the seller's keeping it. They're going to change it to Bob used to have a car wash, Inc. And so there'll be a name change for that. There'll be withdrawal of the trade names. Seller is no longer going to own those trade names. There's going to be a withdrawal of their rights, and the buyer is going to do statement of trade names, and there's going to be filings that they now own the rights. There's going to be loan payoffs that are going to get made. There's going to be potentially liens placed on the business as a result of this transaction. The trademarks are going to transfer. Whoops, these last two items don't count. They were, sorry. So now let's go to post-closing. This is the activity we like to see happen at a closing. The parties are happy. Everything's been done the right way. It's time to celebrate with a champagne. So the takeaways, keep in mind with an LOI, it's not a trial balloon. It's a commitment to purchase. Yes, there are contingencies, but you really are going to do it. And a seller, as a show of trust, is going to enter into one LOI only, but it is non-binding. So you want to get to that purchase agreement as quickly as possible. The APA is legally binding. It indicates certainty. We're at that 99% level. It's going to describe everything that has to happen to make the closing occur. Parties, please use capable attorneys. Don't use a divorce attorney. Don't use an estate attorney. Use a business attorney. You're watching out for the arrow of omission. You want to make sure you haven't forgotten anything. It's the thing you forget that's going to come back and get you. Closing, again, experienced attorney, agreed upon scope of work, mutual agreement. Get those documents out in time for everybody to see them. And funds, more and more, it used to be you got to hand out these beautiful paper checks at closing. More and more, we're seeing delays of 1, 2, 3 days for money to go out because it's all being wired and it needs to clear and everything needs to be cleaned up before the first dollar can be distributed back out. So sellers, unfortunately, you may not get the joy of getting your money on closing day. Any questions that haven't been asked, feel free to send them on chat. This is how to contact Front Range Business. We are happy to talk to you at any time. We certainly appreciate your staying with us today. Appreciate the great questions. I do have another question here came in. What is my experience been with RRF in terms of selling? Maddie, if I could ask you to tell me what RRF is, I'll know what my experience is with it. I don't know. Is the presentation or recording available anywhere? Yes. You will hear from Larimer SBDC, and they will let you know how you can get a copy of this as a recording and as a slide deck, I believe. Anything else? Oh, Restaurant Revitalization Fund. So sorry. Yes. Restaurant Revitalization Fund, what we find is, to answer the question, what we find is that there are loans out there and they have to be dealt with. Most of those loans, or all the loans, came through a commercial lender, and you're going to have policies from that lender. If they have not been repaid, they are typically due to be paid off at the transfer of a business, which means at closing, any of those payoffs will have to happen. So I hope that answered the question. Again, if anybody has a question and they don't feel they got an answer, or they come up with a question later, do not hesitate to contact us. We are really ready to talk about this with everyone. Okay, thank you very much.